everyone, this is the Theoretical Doctor and welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, welcome. This is a series on the chapter Transport in Animals and Plants of chapter 8 of the STPM semester 2 biology series. Check out the full playlist on my channel. If you want to access flashcards on this topic and other videos, do click the link below. It is available on my website as well as slides on this topic. In this video, we will be continuing on cardiac cycle. Before I begin, it is important for you to know the meaning of diastole and systole. Systole is a stage in which the heart muscle contracts and blood in the chambers are pumped out of the heart. So in systole, there is contraction, meaning there's squeezing. It will be caused by an electrical impulse and ejection occurs. Diastole is a stage in the cardiac cycle in which the heart muscle is relaxed, allowing the heart chambers to be filled with blood. Thus, in diastole, relaxation and filling occurs. Hence, systole is contraction, diastole relaxation. I repeat, systole is contraction and diastole is relaxation. Alright, so let's begin with the cardiac cycle. We will start with the atrial and ventricular diastole, meaning both the left and right atria and left and right ventricles are relaxed. In the atrial and ventricular diastole, it is also referred to as the late diastole phase. In the late diastole phase, both the atria and ventricles are both relaxing. So in the atria, filling of blood from the pulmonary veins and also filling of blood from the vena cava. For the ventricles, it has just finished contraction and is now relaxed. So the AV valves are opened. So it's important for you to know the structure of the heart, and if you still find it confusing, do check out my previous video where I've elaborated on the structure of the heart. So the AV valves are open, and the AV valves refer to the mitral and the tricuspid valve. So this is the tricuspid valve, this is the mitral valve. So blood then flows following gravity. Okay, there is no contraction here. Remember, it's in relaxation phase. So blood just flows according to gravity from the atria to the ventricles, as you can see in this diagram over here. And the ventricles, as it begins to fill with blood, it expands to accommodate the blood coming in. So that's for the atrial and ventricular diastole phase, or otherwise known as the late diastole phase. Now we enter the atrial systole phase. Remember, systole means contraction, and in systole there is electrical impulse. Contraction occurs followed by ejection of blood, meaning blood is pumped out or forced out of that particular area, which in this case is the atria, because atrial systole, meaning the left and the right atria. As you can see in the diagram over here, squeezing occurs, contraction occurs. So this occurs and there is completion of the ventricular filling. So the ventricles become full. So most of the blood enters into the ventricle during the atrial diastole phase. Most of it enters like that following gravity. The last 20% enters during atrial systole, meaning when the atrial contracts, it will try to squeeze out whatever left over from the atria into the ventricles. So the end diastolic volume is 130 milliliter each ventricle. Okay, so EDV refers to the end diastolic volume, and the end diastolic volume for each ventricle is 130 milliliters. So atrial systole begins when the wave of depolarization sweeps across the atria, meaning from the SA node, and when it sweeps across the atria, the atrium, both atria, the left and the right, will contract. So the pressure increases during contraction and it pushes the blood. Okay, it pushes the remaining 20% into the ventricles. After the late diastole phase and the atrial systole phase, we proceed with the ventricular systole. In ventricular systole, it is further divided into three phases, which are the early ventricular contraction, the isovolumetric ventricular contraction, and the ventricular ejection. The first one, early ventricular contraction. The first heart sound occurs here, the first heart sound of the heart. So the heart, if you were to auscultate, meaning you were to listen with a stethoscope, you will hear lub, dub, lub, dub. And when you hear lub, which is the first heart sound, okay, it is in this particular phase. Now, how does that happen? So the electrical impulse went from the SA node to the atria, and the atria contracts, right? And now it goes to the AV node. The electrical impulse go to the AV node, and so the ventricles will contract. When the ventricles contract or is being squeezed, like you can see in this picture over here, the blood in the ventricles tries to move up. I mean, if you were to like take your bottle, the one that can be squeezed, of course, because I have one bottle that is very soft. Anyway, so if you were to squeeze it, you will notice that the water moves up, right? So same thing with the heart. When the ventricles squeeze, the blood will try to go to where it came from, meaning the atrium, the atria, the left and the right. And when that happens, the valves present over here will try to stop it, and it stops it by closing. And when it closes, you will hear the lub sound, and the lub is the first heart sound. So which valves are involved? It's the AV valves, which is the atrioventricular valves, the mitral and the tricuspid valve. This is the tricuspid, this is the mitral valve. Next is the isovolumetric ventricular contraction. So the heart is still in contraction mode. Contraction hasn't stopped, and the pressure in the ventricles are high, and the blood is not moving anywhere. Like it's continuously contracting, but the blood can't go anywhere. So the pressure inside the ventricles will continue to build up. Eventually, the pressure is too much, and it's just too much for the ventricles, and then we enter the following phase, which is the ventricular ejection, when the blood is pumped out of the ventricles and into the aorta and the pulmonary artery. Over here, 70 milliliters is being ejected out of each ventricles, and this occurs when the pressure in the ventricles is higher than the SL valves. So when it's higher, it's able to push them open. So the SL valves, the semilunar valves, will open and allow blood to pass through from the ventricles into the aorta and also the pulmonary arteries. So SL is short for semilunar valves and refers to the aortic and the pulmonary valves. So when the blood is ejected out, the AV valves here remains closed, and the remaining blood in each ventricle after it has been ejected out is 60 milliliters, because if you remember, the end diastolic volume is 130 milliliters. So the end systolic volume would be 60 milliliters because 70 milliliters are being ejected out. In a whole, when the ventricular systole occurs, what about the atria? Like, what happened to the atria? So the atria is in diastole phase, meaning in relaxation phase, and while blood is being ejected out of the heart, the atrium is being filled. Now we move on to the last part, which is ventricular diastole. Diastole means relaxation. Over here, feeling of that particular area occurs, which in this case would be the ventricles, because ventricular diastole. So the ventricular diastole can be further divided into ventricular relaxation phase and isometric ventricular relaxation phase. So in ventricular relaxation phase, the second heart sound dub is heard. It represents the end of ventricular ejection. And if you remember, the first heart sound occurs when the AV valve closes. The second heart sound dub is heard when the SL valve, okay, the pulmonary valve and the aortic valve closes. Hence, heart sounds are heard when the heart valve closes. In isovolumetric ventricular relaxation phase, so after the ventricles have ejected the blood, the ventricles pressure then is still high, right? Eventually, the pressure in the ventricles will fall, and as it falls and continues to fall, the blood, eventually it will reach a point where the pressure in the ventricles falls below the pressure of the arteries. So the blood will try to flow back, and the valves are there to prevent it. So when the blood tries to flow back, it pushes against the SL valve, and the SL valve closes. So that's why you hear the second heart sound. In isovolumetric ventricular relaxation, which represents the final phase, the pressure in the ventricles continue to fall, but the AV valves at first will be closed because the pressure in the ventricles are still higher than the pressure in the atria. But eventually, the pressure in the ventricles will continue to fall until one point the pressure in the ventricles becomes lower than the pressure in the atria. And when that happens, the AV valves open. So remember in the very beginning of the cardiac cycle, the late diastole phase, this one, 1. This is that phase, and after that the cycle begins again. This is a summary of the cardiac cycle. Take a moment to pause, go back if needed to listen again to the explanation on each parts. I know that it can be pretty heavy, but take your time to understand, because once you've grasped it, it's relatively easy when you do revision. And it's all about the pressure and which valves are involved in opening and closing. Please don't try to memorize it because you might get this jumbled up. Alright, sometimes you will be given this graph and you need to explain based on the pressure or even draw and label them. It can seem quite confusing. I remembered I tried to memorize this, and when I entered medical school I saw this graph again in my cardiovascular posting, and I tried to memorize it because if we drew it in exam we would score extra points, but actually it's relatively easy to understand. Alright, so I'll try my best to help you understand. So refer to the colors over here. Alright, so the light blue one refers to pressure in the aorta, and the brown one, this one, refers to pressure in the ventricles, and the green one refers to pressure in the atria. So pressure in the aorta, pressure in the ventricles, pressure in the atrium. This part over here refers to the volume of blood in the ventricles. So take note of when the valves open and closes. Initially here, the ventricular pressure, the brown one, is lower than the atrial pressure. Okay, this part here, they're lower than the atrial pressure. So this is in late diastole phase. The AV valves are open, right? Because ventricular filling occurs. Now, when the ventricular pressure exceeds the atrial pressure, so this part here where you can see there's a crossing between both graphs, the AV valve closes, and this is to prevent the backflow of blood from the ventricles into the atria. So you will hear the first heart sound. So the ventricular pressure continues to rise, but it's still lower than the aortic pressure. But once the ventricular pressure exceeds or is higher than the aortic pressure, which you can see in the crossing of two graphs over here, right? It crosses, it's higher, and then the SL valve will open and blood is then pumped out of the ventricles and into the aorta and pulmonary artery. Blood is then ejected out of the heart. So the ventricular pressure goes up, right? And it goes higher than the aortic pressure. So the pressure will continue to go up, but eventually after blood is pumped out, the pressure will fall. And whatever goes up must come down, right? So the ventricular pressure then falls until one point it falls lower than the aortic pressure. You can see from the crossing between two graphs over here. The SL valve, the semilunar valves, will then close, and this is to prevent the backflow from the aorta and pulmonary artery back into the ventricles. So the second heart sound, dub, will be heard over here. So the pressure in the ventricles continue to fall, but it is still higher than the pressure in the aorta. So because of that, the AV valves still remain closed. Eventually, it keeps falling until one point the pressure in the ventricles is lower than the atrial pressure, as you can see over here, the crossing between both graphs. This is then when the pressure of the ventricles falls below the pressure in the atrium, the AV valves will open. So if you look at the bottom graph, this one, when ventricular filling occurs during late diastole phase, the ventricular volume is high. While the pressure is building, the ventricular volume is still high. But after blood is being ejected out of the ventricles, the volume in the ventricles decreases. And when it enters late diastole phase, which is when the AV valve open, ventricular filling occurs and the ventricular volume increases again. Remember that the heart sound occurs when the valve closes. So this part here where the AV valve closes, it refers to the first heart sound, which is lab. And this part over here where the SL valve closes, it refers to the second heart sound, which is dub. If you've reached this point, thank you very much. Hit the like button if you found it helpful, as it does help in reaching out to others as well. Do support my channel by pressing the subscribe button so I will know, and it gives me motivation to continue producing content like this in the future. And finally, share this video to those who might find this helpful. See you in the next one.